Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 for Topic 11. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at work and gender expectations. So, all people work. Most people work for pay, a wage, but just because you're not getting paid obviously doesn't mean that you are not working. And this is true for both men and women. Since 1900, women have made up no less than 19% of the US workforce. And today, women make up about 47% of the US workforce. What that means is that when you look at the total US workforce, a little bit less than half of the workforce is made up of women. Men participate in the labor force at a higher rate. So about 70% of men are working, whereas about 57% of women are working. But when you look at the total workforce, it's about half and half. And in this uh, section, in this topic 11, we're going to be taking a look at the gender pay gap in our discussion. And the gender pay gap, despite uh, laws in place that are supposed to guarantee equity of pay, the gender pay gap continues to persist. And we're going to be looking at reasons why that is and what are some of the remedies. And keep in mind that there, as you'll be learning in your discussion, that there are different gaps for different groups of men and women when it comes to pay gaps. So, why do people work? Well, how we answer that question, there are a lot of different answers for the question of why a person should work. And when we ask the question about why do men work versus why do women work, the way we answer those questions gives us some insight into the traditional gendered expectations for a particular time period. So, why do men work? Well, for money, for sure. You want to be able to pay your bills, but also that there's a traditional gender role expectation regarding work. That even today, and definitely going back, that what it means to be a man is to work. That the way being a man is defined in a society, it still revolves around the sense that men have this obligation, this responsibility to be the bread earner, to be the provider. That it is a reflection of a proper gender role that was a lot more solidified maybe 50 years ago, but there's some of that obviously still persists today. And so a lot of times when you ask men about, particularly when they are not working or and what they miss about working, is that it will revolve around these traditional gender roles. That they feel like that they are the head of the household, that they are a family provider, that they need to be a breadwinner, and that there is a link between working and feeling like you are living up to your potential, a sense of self fulfillment. In light of these gender role when when men are working, um, society sees that as a good thing, right? If the assumption is that men are the breadwinners, that men are providing for their family, that when men are able to do that, then it's an indicator that the society and the economy is healthy. On the flip side of that, when men are not working, when men lose their jobs, it's seen as a red flag. Something must be wrong. It's an indicator of social and economic disease or failure. And that even though we've moved a long way in terms of sort of, challenging these gendered expectations as it relates to work, they still persist into the 21st century. Following the Great Recession. So there was I know you guys, some of you are young, so you might not remember, but over about 12 years ago, there was a collapse of the economy. It's known as the Great Recession. And a lot of people lost work. But it was the first time in US history in 2010, kind of, just as we were sort of coming out of the recession, but it was still, very profound, that women, for the first time in history, made up the majority of the workforce, indicating that men's jobs or jobs that men normally hold were more impacted by the recession. And a lot of the jobs were manufacturing jobs, working in factories. Not that women don't work in factories, they do, but men are more likely to work in manufacturing than women. And those jobs have been going to the wayside for quite some time, but they were extraordinarily impacted by the Great Recession. And during that time when men lost their jobs, they reported feeling like failing as being a man. There were studies done trying to get a sense of how men were feeling as a result of losing their jobs. And a lot of men would report that they felt like they weren't a man, that they had failed their family, that they had let down their kids, etc. To agree that women don't normally report. So, as I stated, that men in particular, low skilled white men, blue collar workers, experienced significant job loss following the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. And as I said on the last slide, that 2010, it's the first time in history that women make up the majority of the workforce. And some have sort of, as I mentioned in the last slide, have sort of wondered about what the consequences of that is. And that one of the phenomenons that we're seeing is that when you look at that group, men, white men, lower skill, blue collar workers who lost jobs, that when you look at mortality rate in this group, that the mortality rate is actually, like we've seen like an increase in mortality rate in this group that was very, very abnormal. See that there is an increase in liver disease that could be contributed to drinking, people poisoning, alcoholic poisoning, and drug overdose, and also an increase in suicide. And so some have sort of, connected this job loss that group of people experienced to potential increases in mortality, particularly given the causes of that mortality. And I mean, it's not a causation, but it could be seen as a correlation about this sense of this sense of that if you feel like as a man you're supposed to live up to these things and you don't, that there's sort of a mental health consequence of that might result in um, uh, lowering of mortality. Obviously, there's also an increased report of pain, opioid use, and alcohol abuse. One aspect of this that people sort of speculated on is whether or not this played a factor in the 2016 election. As we know, that group of white collar men, or I'm sorry, white men, blue collar, low skill workers who don't have a college education, that was a group that was really likely to vote for Trump. And so, not that there's necessarily a correlation there between gender expectations, but in many ways, Donald Trump sort of satisfies or like lives up to this, like what a man's man or something like that. But anyways, the broader point here is that that because of those increased use of alcohol and opioids seem to be coupled with job loss, that it might indicate that there is still a persistent gendered role expectation regarding men and the importance of men working. All right, so let's shift gears to gendered expectations regarding why women work. Um, well, what it means to be a woman from a traditional gender role expectation, it you work, but the work is at home. And that is particularly the case for women who have children, for mothers, so that there's an obligation, responsibility, probably proper gender roles. That women are the work at home; they're the homemaker. Women work at being the best mother possible. That women are the hearth maintainer, the sanctuary in the storm. So that it's not that women don't work, but that the work that they do is in the private sphere. That private sphere is in the home, and these are the jobs of women: homemaker, mother, hearth maintainer. In light of these gendered expectations for women, historically, when women are not working, that is an indicator of social and economic health. So it's the opposite. When men are not working, that's seen as a bad thing. But when women are not working, that's seen as a good thing. But when women are working, whoops, something must be going wrong with the economy or with our society. Some sort of failure, some sort of like economic or social disease. Because it's a breakdown in the traditional gender formula. And so that what could be going on is that there is, the traditional gender formula is man, head of household, woman having the opportunity or to stay home, right? That's to satisfy their traditional gender role. If they're not doing that, then they're working because of divorce or widowhood, or that they're single parents, or that there's some failure of a man to provide support. So when women enter the workforce, it's seen as a social negative. It could be seen as a breakdown in security. That is like national security, that men are fighting war, which is, wars are not seen as like like healthy nations, unfortunately, don't shouldn't have to go to war. So when men are fighting wars, women take their place, right? So that the women being in the workforce is temporary, right, and a reflection of some sort of national security or international security meltdown. And also sort of a breakdown in the economy, that when there's a boom, sort of like, which could actually be seen as sort of like economic unhealth, like that there is way too much economic productivity, and therefore there are a lot of jobs, right? And those jobs need to be filled, right? So where women step in at that point. And if there's a bust, right, that men, because like we see in 2009, have lost these traditional manufacturing jobs, right? Well, then maybe because they're not working due to that bust, women need to, step in and provide, to get a job that's still available, in order to make ends meet. The gender expectation for women to work is not as persistent as it is for men. Um, when given the long sort of traditional gendered roles, that if women choose to stay home after having children, or if women choose not to work, there's going to be maybe less social like pressure or condemnation of that, because it kind of corresponds um, with traditional gender norms. Although obviously that changes after second wave feminism, where this sense of like what it means to be a true woman is to be a feminist, and if you stay home, you're somehow like not totally worthy, which to be honest is, was, the backlash that when it came to the ERA, the sense of, what it means to be a woman is to be independent and autonomous. A lot of that backlash did come from conservative women like Phyllis Schlafly and others, and it was that sense of that, you're not valued if you stay at home. Did have provide a resonated with a lot of women at that time period, and successfully in part led to the ERA not getting ratified. So the gender expectation for women to work is not as persistent as it is for men, but I mean obviously it's more nuanced and complicated than that. However, in the 21st century, that these expectations still play a role in women's well-being, their sense of self, particularly for working women. And so, working women, or working mothers, often sort of report when asked about their sort of the mental health and how they're coping, is that they feel like there's this pressure to be like the super mom, right? That or the super woman, the woman who has it all, right? That not only are you able to work and do great at your job and move up the corporate ladder, but you're also able to be the best mom. You're still there helping, take your kids to the medical appointments, nurturing your kids, making cupcakes for school if they still allow you to do that. But women sort of report that in their effort to have it all, they sometimes feel like they're a failure on all fronts, right? Which is a reflection of these, gendered norms that they still sort of persist. That if they stay home from work due to taking care of their kids if they're sick, and they choose to do that because they feel like they want to be there for them, then they're at home, worrying about work. And then when they're at work, they're, worrying about the kids in the home and what they're missing out on. And so there's a sense that you have guilt about returning to work because, like, oh, am I failing as a mother, because I'm not the nurturer? But is there also this guilt about staying home, right? Like, oh, if I stay at home, am I like, feeding into these traditional gender stereotypes? And so the fact that women report out these sorts of conflicts and experience these sorts of conflicts mentally, it's still an indicator of the persistence of these traditional gender norms as it relates to work. So, just some questions to think about in conclusion here. So, do we still link what it means to be a man to their ability to work and provide? In other words, are these traditional perspectives about gender roles, are they still really persistent? For the guys in the class, if you think about if you get married or in a partnership and, you know, and you have kids, and you lost your job, do you feel like that you would be failing to provide for your family? That you had somehow sort of failed on that front. On the flip side, if you're a guy and you have kids, have you thought about being a stay-at-home dad? And the do you think there's still a stigma that's associated with that? Even with in gay couples sometimes report like about power dynamics within the relationship. We sometimes think about in gay marriages, gay partnerships, and lesbian partnerships. There's a lot less traditional like pressure in terms of gender roles because each couple is the same sex. But in some reports show that in gay marriages that the person who has the more economic power has a higher paying job actually tends to wield more power in the relationship, and that can be a source of conflict within a gay marriage or relationship. And so even there, it seems that this linking to providing for families or for couples as a man is sort of still linked to that gender, that expectation, even in gay relationships. And on the flip side of that, if you're a woman and you're thinking about if you're married to a man or in a relationship with a man, I mean, and they lost their job, I mean, rationally be like, yes, that's fine, we're a team, we'll work this out. But do you think at an emotional level that it might have a different impact on how you see this person, particularly if you sort of saw them as provider? And on the flip side, in lesbian couples, a lot of times the power dynamic revolves around not who has the better job or makes more money, but in lesbian couples, the power dynamic revolves around who's the better mom, right? That particularly if the lesbian couple has kids. So the person who does the best job nurturing is the one who's sort of seen as like having more power in the relationship, and that can be a source of conflict. And so that's sort of interesting because it kind of even in relationships where you think there wouldn't be as much persistence in terms of traditional gender roles, that they still persist even in same-sex relationships. Um, are we more likely to see men not working as a problem and less likely to be concerned when women are not in the workforce or reduced? I bring that up because of the coronavirus pandemic. Um, During the pandemic, that the the industries that have been hardest hit by the pandemic have been industries that are where women's employment is more concentrated. Restaurants and other retail establishments, in hospitality and in healthcare, and child care as well. And so women are like really being hard hit by the pandemic. Whereas in the Great Recession, men in manufacturing and construction were much more hard hit by that recession. Do you think that there would be more of a outcry in terms of providing economic relief? I mean, those packages aren't getting passed by Congress. Do you think that is maybe in part because women more likely jobs that women hold are more adversely affected? And if men's jobs were more adversely affected by the pandemic, perhaps there would be more like policy support for that. Just speculation. And do you still think that what it means to be a woman, it means staying home to care of kids, especially when the kids are younger? And so, think about, is there this sense that women are sort of like more better nurturers? And do you think that there is still that? And is there a stigma for working moms? Is there a stigma for women who choose to be a stay at home mom? And so just getting you to think about just how robust these gendered expectations are. Okay, thanks for listening.